When I heard that my neighbour, 82-year-old Mrs. Miller, had sold her house for £50,000, I knew something was terribly wrong, because a similar house on the same street had sold for £350,000 just last month, and as a retired mathematics teacher of 30 years, I knew numbers very well. When I discovered how many elderly people that estate agent Nathan Clarke had been targeting in our neighbourhood, I realised I could no longer remain silent. When I heard that my neighbour, 82-year-old Mrs. Miller, had sold her house for £50,000, I knew something was terribly wrong. Because a similar house on the same street had sold for £350,000 just last month, and as a retired mathematics teacher of 30 years, I knew numbers very well. When I discovered how many elderly people that estate agent Nathan Clarke had been targeting in our neighbourhood, I realised I could no longer remain silent. My name is Robert Harrison, 67 years old, and I've been living on Maple Grove Lane in the quiet suburb of Woodbridge for 35 years. I taught mathematics at the local comprehensive school until my retirement 3 years ago. My wife Eleanor passed away 4 years ago from cancer, leaving me alone in our 4-bedroom Victorian house. The neighbourhood had always been peaceful, filled with families and elderly residents who had lived here for decades. Mrs. Miller lived 2 houses down from me. She was a sweet woman who had lost her husband 5 years ago and struggled with early-stage dementia. Her children lived in Australia and rarely visited. I often helped her with grocery shopping and small repairs around her house. She trusted me completely, calling me her guardian angel. 3 weeks ago, Mrs. Miller seemed unusually excited. She knocked on my door one afternoon, clutching some papers in her shaking hands. "Robert," she said, breathless with excitement, "I have wonderful news. A lovely young man came to visit me yesterday. He said my house is worth much more than I thought, and he can help me sell it quickly so I can move to a nice retirement home." I felt a chill run down my spine. "Mrs. Miller," I said gently, "what exactly did this man tell you?" She showed me a business card. Nathan Clarke, Senior Property Consultant, Prestige Estates. The card looked professional with a sleek logo and contact information. "He said my house is worth £60,000, she continued, "but because it needs some work, he can arrange a quick sale for £50,000. He was so kind, Robert. He even brought me tea and biscuits." I examined the paperwork she showed me. It was a preliminary sales agreement filled with complex legal language that would confuse anyone, let alone an elderly woman with memory issues. The terms were heavily skewed in favour of the buyer, with clauses that would make it nearly impossible for Mrs. Miller to back out once she signed. "Mrs. Miller," I said carefully, "have you spoken to your children about this?" She looked confused for a moment. "Oh, yes," she said. "Nathan said it would be better to surprise them with the good news after everything is finalised. He said they would be so proud of me for handling everything myself." That evening, I could not sleep. I kept thinking about Mrs. Miller and the predatory way this Nathan Clarke had approached her. I decided to do some research. I spent hours online looking up property values in our area. The average price for houses similar to Mrs. Miller's was between £300,000 and £400,000. A quick sale at £50,000 was not just undervalued, it was criminal. The next morning, I decided to investigate further. I walked around the neighbourhood, paying closer attention to recently sold houses. I noticed something disturbing. 3 other elderly residents had sold their homes in the past 6 months, all at significantly below market value. Mrs. Thompson at number 15 had sold for £70,000, Mr. Edwards at number 22 for £65,000, and old Mrs. Bennet at the corner for 55,000. I started keeping a notebook, documenting everything I could find about these sales. I visited the local library and searched through property records and newspaper archives. What I discovered made my blood run cold. Nathan Clarke had been systematically targeting elderly residents across 3 neighbourhoods, always using the same tactics: appearing helpful, offering quick sales, and pressuring them to keep deals secret from families. I realised I was looking at something much bigger than just Mrs. Miller's situation. This was an organised operation designed to exploit vulnerable elderly people. And if I did not act soon, Mrs. Miller would become another victim in Nathan Clarke's growing list of conquests. The following week, I decided to take a more direct approach. I needed to understand exactly how Nathan Clarke operated and gather concrete evidence of his fraudulent activities. As a mathematics teacher, I had always believed in systematic research and careful documentation. I started by visiting the elderly residents who had recently sold their properties. Mrs. Thompson at number 15 was the first person I approached. She was a 78-year-old widow who had lived in the neighbourhood for over 20 years. When I knocked on her door, I was surprised to find her still living in the house she had supposedly sold. "Mrs. Thompson," I said carefully, "I heard you had sold your house recently. How are the moving arrangements going?" Her face immediately changed, and she looked embarrassed. "Oh, Robert," she said, inviting me in. "I made such a terrible mistake. That nice young man Nathan told me I could sell the house and then rent it back from the new owners for a very reasonable price." I examined the rental agreement she showed me. The terms were shocking. After an initial 6-month period at £200, the rent would increase to £800 per month, well above market rates. There were also clauses allowing the landlord to terminate the agreement with just 30 days' notice for any reason. "Mrs. Thompson," I said gently, "do you understand what will happen after the first 6 months?" She looked confused. "Nathan said we could renegotiate the terms if needed. He seemed so trustworthy, Robert. He even brought flowers for my late husband's grave when he came to sign the papers." I spent the next hour explaining the true implications of the agreement. By the time I left, Mrs. Thompson was in tears, realizing she had been manipulated into giving up her home for a fraction of its value while being trapped in an exploitative rental arrangement. My next visit was to Mr. Edwards at number 22. He had already moved to a small flat across town. When I found his new address, I was shocked by the condition of the building. It was a run-down complex with poor heating and maintenance issues. Mr. Edwards was an 80-year-old retired postal worker who walked with a cane. His small flat was cramped and depressing. "Robert," he said, "I have been wondering if I made the right decision." Nathan assured me that selling quickly was the best option because property values were about to crash. I asked to see the paperwork from his sale. What I discovered was even more disturbing. Nathan had presented Mr. Edwards with fake market analysis reports showing declining property values in the area. The documents looked professional, complete with charts and graphs, but the data was entirely fabricated. "Mr. Edwards," I said carefully, "property values in our neighbourhood have actually been increasing, not decreasing. The house next to yours sold for £280,000 just 2 months after your sale." The colour drained from his face. "But Nathan showed me all those reports," he said weakly. I trusted him because he seemed so knowledgeable and professional. I left with crucial evidence of Nathan Clarke's systematic fraud. The fake market reports would be vital proof of his criminal intent. That evening, I organised all the evidence I had gathered This was far more serious than I had initially realized, and I knew I needed help to stop him. The next morning, I knew I needed professional help to build a proper case against Nathan Clarke. As a retired teacher, I understood the importance of having all facts and evidence properly organized before taking action. I decided to contact someone with legal expertise who could guide me through the process. I called my former colleague James Wilson, who had retired from teaching 5 years earlier and had since become a volunteer advisor for Citizens Advice Bureau. James had always been passionate about helping people navigate legal issues, and I knew he would understand the seriousness of the situation. "Robert," James said, when I explained what I'd discovered, "this sounds like systematic fraud. You need to contact the police. But first we should make sure you have everything properly documented. Can you bring me all the evidence you have gathered so far?" We arranged to meet at his house that afternoon. I brought my notebook, copies of all the fraudulent documents, photographs of the properties, and detailed notes from my conversations with the victims. James reviewed everything carefully, asking detailed questions about each case. "This is more serious than you might realize," James said after examining all the evidence. "Nathan Clarke is committing multiple criminal offences: document fraud, misrepresentation, exploitation of vulnerable adults, and potentially money laundering if he is using shell companies to hide the proceeds." James helped me organise everything into a comprehensive file. We created a timeline of Nathan's activities, a victim impact summary, and a detailed breakdown of the financial losses each elderly person had suffered. The total amount stolen through undervalued sales was staggering, over £600,000 from just the 4 cases I had identified. But James warned me that we needed to be careful about how we proceeded. Nathan Clarke clearly knows how to manipulate the system, and if he realizes he is being investigated, he might destroy evidence or target more victims quickly before disappearing. "I suggest we do 2 things simultaneously," James said. "First, we report this to the police with all our evidence. Second, we try to identify any other victims in the area. Nathan has probably been operating for much longer than we realize." That evening, I began researching property sales in the broader area around Woodbridge. Using online property databases and local newspaper archives, I started identifying patterns of unusually low-priced sales to elderly sellers over the past 2 years. What I found was alarming. I discovered at least 12 additional cases where elderly homeowners had sold properties for significantly below market value. Most of these sales involved Prestige Estates, Nathan Clarke's company. The pattern was always the same: elderly seller, quick sale, price well below market value. I spent the next 3 days visiting these additional victims or their families. Many of the elderly sellers had since moved to care homes or passed away, but their relatives confirmed similar stories of pressure, false information, and exploitation. Mrs. Foster's daughter told me her 85-year-old mother had been convinced to sell her house for £70,000 after Nathan Clarke claimed it had serious structural problems. The house sold again 6 months later for £320,000 after minimal renovation. Each new case I uncovered revealed the same sophisticated pattern of deception. Nathan Clarke was running a calculated and systematic operation designed to steal hundreds of thousands of pounds from vulnerable elderly people. By the end of the week, I had identified 16 separate cases of fraud involving Nathan Clarke, with total financial losses exceeding £1.2 million. The evidence was overwhelming, and I knew it was time to take formal action. On Monday morning, James and I walked into Woodbridge Police Station with 2 large folders containing all our evidence against Nathan Clarke. Detective Inspector Sarah Matthews was assigned to our case, and I could see she was immediately impressed by the thoroughness of our documentation. "This is exceptional work," Detective Matthews said after reviewing our materials. "We rarely see fraud cases presented with this level of detail. However, prosecuting sophisticated fraud can be challenging, especially when the perpetrator has been careful to make everything appear legal on the surface." She explained that while Nathan Clarke's actions were clearly unethical and predatory, proving criminal intent in court would require catching him in the act of deliberately deceiving victims. The fake documents were strong evidence, but Nathan could claim they were honest mistakes. Detective Matthews suggested we set up a controlled operation to catch Nathan in the act of fraud. If we could document him knowingly providing false information to a potential victim, it would provide clear evidence of criminal intent needed for successful prosecution. The plan we developed was simple and brilliant. I would pose as an elderly widower looking to sell my house quickly due to financial difficulties. James would help coordinate the operation, while Detective Matthews would arrange for undercover surveillance and recording equipment. We spent 2 days preparing. I practiced acting confused and vulnerable, the perfect target for Nathan's predatory tactics. James helped me create a believable backstory about needing money for medical expenses and wanting to move closer to family. On Wednesday afternoon, I called Prestige Estates and asked to speak with Nathan Clarke about selling my house. His assistant scheduled an appointment for Friday morning, and I could hear excitement in Nathan's voice when I mentioned I was 78 years old and needed to sell quickly. Friday morning arrived, and I felt nervous but determined. Detective Matthews had equipped me with a small recording device hidden in my jacket, and there were surveillance officers positioned around my property. James was parked down the street, monitoring the situation. Nathan Clarke arrived precisely at 10 o'clock, driving an expensive BMW and wearing an immaculate suit. He was younger than I had expected, probably in his early 30s, with the kind of polished appearance that would immediately inspire trust in elderly victims. I played my role perfectly, explaining that my late wife's medical bills had left me in debt and that I needed to move to a smaller place closer to my daughter in Scotland. Nathan listened sympathetically, making supportive comments and asking probing questions about my financial situation. When we walked through the house, Nathan began his deceptive assessment. He pointed out imaginary problems with the roof, claimed the heating system was outdated and potentially dangerous, and suggested that the electrical wiring might not meet current safety standards. He pulled out official-looking documents that appeared to be recent surveys and market analysis reports. According to these fabricated materials, my house was worth no more than £80,000, and even that would be difficult to achieve given the supposed structural problems. However, Nathan continued, I have a client who specializes in renovation projects and might be willing to take on a property like this. He could offer you £75,000 for a quick cash sale. By the time Nathan left, he was convinced he had secured another easy victim. He promised to have paperwork ready by Monday. As his BMW disappeared down the street, I felt satisfaction and disgust at how easily he had deployed his predatory tactics. Detective Matthews and her team had recorded everything, capturing clear evidence of Nathan's systematic deception and fraudulent misrepresentation. The trap had worked perfectly. The following Monday morning, I received a call from Detective Matthews that I had been waiting for. We have enough evidence to make an arrest, she said. Nathan Clarke will be taken into custody this afternoon when he arrives at your house with the fraudulent paperwork. At exactly 2 o'clock, Nathan Clarke arrived at my door, carrying a leather briefcase and wearing his usual confident smile. He had no idea that Detective Matthews and 3 other officers were positioned around my property, ready to move in. "Mr. Harrison," Nathan said cheerfully, "I have all the paperwork ready for our transaction. My client is very excited about purchasing your property, and we can have everything finalized today if you are ready to sign." He spread the documents across my kitchen table with practiced efficiency. The contracts were filled with the same deceptive clauses and undervalued pricing that he had used to exploit his previous victims. As he began explaining the terms, Detective Matthews gave the signal. "Nathan Clarke, you are under arrest on suspicion of fraud, misrepresentation, and exploitation of vulnerable adults," Detective Matthews announced as she entered my kitchen. Nathan's face went pale, and his confident demeanor crumbled instantly. "This is a mistake," Nathan stammered, looking desperately between me and the detective. "Mr. Harrison contacted me voluntarily. This is a legitimate business transaction." Detective Matthews smiled coldly. "There is no misunderstanding, Mr. Clarke. We have recorded evidence of you knowingly providing false information to Mr. Harrison, fabricating structural problems with his property, and attempting to purchase it for a fraction of its true value." As the officers handcuffed Nathan and read him his rights, I felt a profound sense of satisfaction. This man had destroyed the financial security of so many vulnerable elderly people, and now he would finally face the consequences. The case against Nathan Clarke moved through the legal system with remarkable speed. The evidence we had gathered, combined with the recorded sting operation, made his guilt undeniable. In total, the investigation revealed that Nathan had defrauded 23 elderly victims over 3 years, stealing over £2 million. During the trial, I was called as a key witness to testify about both my investigation and the sting operation. Standing in the courtroom, looking directly at Nathan Clarke as I described his predatory tactics, I felt proud of the role I had played in bringing him to justice. Nathan Clarke was sentenced to 8 years in prison for fraud, with additional charges for money laundering and exploitation of vulnerable adults. The court also ordered him to pay full restitution to his victims. More importantly, the publicity surrounding the case led to new protections for elderly property sellers. The local council implemented new regulations requiring independent legal representation for any property sale involving sellers over 75 years old. Mrs. Miller was able to recover her house when Nathan's fraudulent sale was declared invalid by the court. Mrs. Thompson's exploitative rental agreement was also cancelled, allowing her to remain in her home without threat of massive rent increases. 6 months after Nathan's conviction, I received a letter from the Chief Constable commending my investigation. But the real reward came from knowing that no more elderly residents would fall victim to Nathan Clarke's predatory schemes. As I sat in my garden one evening, reflecting on everything that had happened, I realized that my background as a mathematics teacher had been crucial to this investigation. My ability to analyze numbers, identify patterns, and organize evidence systematically had made it possible to build an unshakable case. The experience taught me that sometimes the most important lessons happen outside the classroom, and that standing up for what is right can make a real difference in protecting the most vulnerable members of our community.